Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. 5 seconds. That's all it took for a 27-year-old morning news anchor to vanish. 5 seconds. The time between Jodi stepping out of her apartment door and her entire existence dissolving into the early morning fog of Mason City, Iowa. June 27th, 1995. A Tuesday. She was running late for work, told her producer she'd be right there, and then nothing. Outside her unit at the Key Apartments, her red Mazda Miata sat oddly angled, not quite in its usual space. The driver's side mirror was bent. Her high heels were left scattered on the wet pavement. One toppled under the driver door, the other near her dropped blow dryer. Her earrings, a broken car key, and a hairspray can lay near what investigators would later identify as a wide smear mark, faint but present. The door to her car had been left ajar. Whatever had happened that morning happened fast and violently. The initial call to police didn't come from a neighbor, nor from anyone who heard screams, though some would later say they had. It came from Kimti TV, the station that employed her. A colleague had been expecting her by 4:30 a.m. to prep for the early broadcast. At 7 a.m., still no Jodi. The anchor chair sat empty. They called. No answer. They drove to her apartment. Her car was there, but she wasn't. They called Mason City Police, and that's when the case began. Police arrived at the scene around 7:15 a.m. There was no sign of forced entry to the apartment itself. The scene outside the car, however, immediately raised red flags. Personal items were strewn across a radius of several feet, not consistent with someone casually dropping things. The key to the Miata was broken off in the lock, bent and twisted. The car's gear was set in park, untouched. No purse, no phone, no sign of Jodi. From the beginning, investigators suspected an abduction, not a voluntary disappearance. The weather was damp that morning. Rainfall the night before had left the pavement slick, which ironically made trace collection difficult. There were no visible footprints in the mud, no tire impressions that led away in haste, no shell casings, no blood trail. But the disarray of the scene pointed toward a confrontation. A neighbor reported hearing what they thought was a scream or a shout around 4:30 a.m. Another claimed to have seen a van, white or light-colored, parked oddly near Jodi's vehicle, then disappearing shortly after. Neither statement led to solid identifications. No one had seen Jodi herself that morning. No surveillance camera pointed at the lot. No doorbell cameras in 1995. No real-time digital witness. Jodi had no known enemies. She was, by all accounts, well-liked, energetic, and professionally ambitious. She lived alone, had dated casually, maintained contact with her family in Minnesota, and had recently vacationed with friends. No obvious motive surfaced. No ransom demand came. Her apartment was tidy. Nothing inside indicated she'd left in a rush. No packed bags, no open drawers, no missing items. The FBI entered the case within days. Forensic teams examined every inch of the vehicle and surrounding area. Fingerprints were pulled but returned inconclusive, smudged, partial, unmatchable. A single strand of blonde hair was collected near the passenger side door, bagged and cataloged. It matched Jodi's own. Soil samples, fiber transfers, and fragments from the key were all submitted to the state lab, with rush orders attached. But this was 1995. DNA analysis was still in early form. There was no national database robust enough to make a match unless the suspect was already in the system. No match came. Investigators began mapping a timeline. They built backward from the last known confirmed interaction, a phone call at 4:10 a.m., where Jodi told a producer she had overslept but was getting ready and would be in soon. Phone records showed no outgoing calls afterward, no unusual incoming numbers. Her alarm was found set. The shower was damp. The coffee maker hadn't been used. Then came a detail that felt small but stood out. A journal entry, logged a few weeks prior, where Jodi mentioned she felt like she was being followed. "Someone is watching me," she wrote. The entry had no name, no detail, just the sentence. Her mother confirmed that Jodi had once said she thought someone had been messing with her car, possibly moving it slightly during the night. But no formal complaint had been filed. This opened up another line of questioning. Was Jodi being stalked? And if so, was the abduction premeditated? Investigators turned their attention to known acquaintances. They mapped recent social interactions. One name emerged again and again: John Von Cease, a longtime friend, nearly 2 decades her senior, who often hosted gatherings for the KIMT crew and had taken Jodi on a weekend boating trip. Just days earlier, he had thrown a birthday party for her, a small gathering at his place. Friends said he doted on her. He referred to her, oddly, as his girl. When asked, Von Cease volunteered that he was the last person to see Jodi alive. They had watched a video from her birthday party at his place the night before her disappearance. He said he hugged her goodbye around 8:30 p.m. and hadn't seen or spoken to her since. He cooperated with police. No signs of struggle, no apparent motive. But something about his openness, the way he volunteered detail unprompted, struck one detective as too aligned. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Still, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. And without Jodi's body, or even confirmation of death, there was no crime scene to prosecute. Mason City PD conducted door-to-door interviews in the complex. They held press conferences. A $20,000 reward was posted. A tip line was established. The media covered it heavily. Leads trickled in. None panned out. 29 years later, as of June 2025, the case remains unsolved. By June 1995, Jodi Heisentrut was a recognizable face in northern Iowa. She anchored the morning news for KIMT TV in Mason City. Her segments were punctual, rehearsed, and consistent. She was the kind of local media personality who was easily approachable, someone who, according to coworkers, never missed call time without notifying the newsroom. That's why the missed broadcast on June 27 wasn't seen as a fluke. It was an anomaly. And in investigations like these, anomalies are never ignored. To better understand what happened, the team assigned to her disappearance needed to reconstruct more than just the timeline. They had to map out her personal behavior patterns. Her daily schedule, interaction frequency, and interpersonal boundaries became part of a forensic behavioral profile. The objective was to establish baselines for her movements, communications, and deviations in the days leading up to her disappearance. The starting point was her routine. Jodi typically arrived at the station between 3:50 a.m. and 4:10 a.m. to prepare for her 6 a.m. broadcast. She lived alone at Key Apartments, less than a mile from the station. She often prepped her clothes and notes the night before. Surveillance wasn't common at that complex in 1995, and her unit faced a parking lot, which remained poorly lit during early hours. On June 26, the day before she vanished, Jodi reportedly left work by early evening. According to station logs, she completed her shift at 1:30 p.m. with no additional assignments. She made several phone calls from her apartment that night, confirmed via phone records, including one to a colleague and another to her mother in Minnesota. The last confirmed interaction was with a friend named John Van Cease. He stated that she had come over to his residence around 8 p.m. to watch a video from her recent birthday celebration. He claimed she left before 9 p.m. and appeared to be in good spirits. That timeline remained unchallenged, but there were details in her own writing that drew attention. Investigators located a personal journal in Jodi's apartment. It wasn't encrypted or hidden. Inside, a series of entries documented her thoughts over several weeks. Most were routine: work-related fatigue, professional aspirations, notes about local community events. But one sentence dated June 7 stood out. "I think someone's been watching me lately." That entry was isolated, no names, no further elaboration, just that one sentence in isolation. The phrasing wasn't accusatory, it didn't name anyone, but it was enough to warrant consideration. In forensic psychology, victim premonition entries, when supported by physical signs, can be significant, especially when they align with observable changes in routine. And Jodi's behavior had shifted subtly. Her coworkers mentioned that she began double-checking that her car was locked. One technician recalled seeing her glance over her shoulder after late shifts, which was uncharacteristic. Another noted she had mentioned someone messing with her car, possibly adjusting her mirrors or moving it slightly in the night. At the time, she brushed it off as harmless, maybe even a prank. While none of these observations were proof of threat, they formed a pattern. The FBI's victimology assessment team flagged the entries for further review. Their concern wasn't just the written statement, it was the absence of follow-up. A person who fears they're being watched often either becomes hypervigilant or dismissive. Jodi's lack of reported complaints suggested the latter. That kind of dismissal isn't rare in cases involving women who work in visible roles, particularly in small-town media, where personal space is often minimized by public access. Her apartment itself had no signs of forced entry. The door had been locked. There were no pry marks or indications of tampering. Her purse was missing, which investigators noted as unusual. For a person preparing for work, especially one expected on camera, a purse would likely be among the essentials taken. Its absence, coupled with the other items found scattered outside, supported the hypothesis that she was intercepted between her front door and vehicle. In victim behavior analysis, the focus often shifts from what the victim did to what they stopped doing. Jodi, in the week before her disappearance, had canceled a weekend boating trip, a plan she had made with friends. She said she wasn't feeling up to it, which was out of character. She had also skipped a local charity event where she was expected to MC. Small changes, yes, but when layered, they implied a possible internalized sense of unease. Investigators examined her phone logs. There were no incoming or outgoing calls from unknown numbers in the week prior. No threats, no recorded complaints with local law enforcement. Yet the unease remained present, just beneath the surface. The question investigators kept returning to was simple. Was Jodi Heisentrud aware of the danger she was in? Or had it crept up silently without her recognizing the escalation? One possibility raised was that of a parasocial relationship, a common risk for public-facing figures. A viewer who misinterprets a professional, distant persona as an invitation for intimacy. It happens gradually. Unsolicited letters, unexpected gifts, unannounced visits. In extreme cases, it escalates to stalking or confrontation. There were no direct signs this had occurred. No notes, no reported gifts, no trespassing complaints. But law enforcement, particularly those in the behavioral unit, didn't rule it out. If such a person existed, they could have remained beneath the radar. Mason City in 1995 didn't have high-resolution surveillance or license plate scanners. The apartment complex wasn't gated, and it was easy enough for someone to watch unnoticed, especially someone familiar with her schedule. There was another detail. In the weeks following her disappearance, co-workers recalled that Jodi had recently changed her morning routine. She had begun parking her car slightly further away from her apartment entrance, citing more light over there. It suggested situational awareness. She had noticed something, but again, hadn't reported it. Sometimes the victim knows something's wrong, but they don't know how wrong until it's too late. The parking lot at Key Apartments wasn't cordoned off until after 8:01 a.m., nearly 4 hours after Jodi Heisentrud was scheduled to be live on air. That delay, while understandable for a small department in a quiet Iowa city, had consequences. By the time Mason City police began collecting evidence, potential contamination had already occurred. Foot traffic, light rainfall, and even the well-meaning station colleague who had knocked on Jodi's door earlier that morning. Still, the scene held key indicators, subtle but telling. First, the vehicle. Jodi's red Mazda Miata was parked slightly off-center from its usual alignment. Officers noted the driver's side mirror was bent inward. Her key was broken off in the lock, suggesting an attempt to unlock the car under duress or while being physically restrained. Items that would typically be inside a purse were scattered nearby. Lipstick, a hairdryer, her earrings, and a pair of high-heeled shoes, one of which was found several feet from the other. The car door was ajar. Crime scene techs logged and photographed every item. A dampness covered most surfaces due to light overnight rain. The impact on trace evidence was immediate. Any latent prints on smooth surfaces were compromised, while impressions in soil or grass became unreliable. However, some elements remained usable. A partial boot print was recovered near the driver's side of the vehicle. The tread did not match any footwear known to belong to Jodi. It was logged, cast, and later identified as a common work boot pattern. Size unknown due to partial impression. Notably, the print faced the car, not away from it. Fibers recovered from the door handle included one dark synthetic strand that did not match anything inside the vehicle or Jodie's known wardrobe. That fiber was bagged and flagged for comparison to carpet or upholstery, pending any future suspect vehicle match. Without a point of comparison, however, it remained a piece of evidence without context. The most useful data came from the trace collection performed along the outer doorframe. A single blonde hair was located, consistent with Jodie's. Additionally, a faint skin cell transfer, believed to be the result of a grip or struggle, was collected near the upper frame of the door. In 1995, touch DNA was not yet a widely accessible forensic tool. Samples were preserved but not immediately processed. The forensic team also reviewed the pattern of item dispersion. Jodie's shoes were found in opposite directions, one partially under the driver door, the other approximately 4 feet behind the car. Her hairspray can was dented, indicating it had hit a hard surface. Her earring backings were bent. These details, while minor in isolation, supported the theory of a physical altercation occurring in close proximity to the vehicle. There was no blood found, no visible injuries sustained on site. This suggested that if force was used, it was either non-lethal or concealed during the abduction. Several neighbors were interviewed within hours. Most had already left for work. A man on the second floor of the building across the lot recalled hearing a sharp yell or scream between 4:30 and 4:45 a.m., followed by what he described as car door slams and tires rolling. He hadn't looked out the window. Another resident reported seeing a white van parked unusually close to Jodie's car earlier that morning, but could not recall a license plate or provide a make or model. Investigators canvassed the nearby streets for any matching vehicle descriptions. Dozens of vans were checked. None stood out. Without surveillance footage, standard CCTV was not installed in that area. The report went into the file as unconfirmed but plausible. By day's end, law enforcement had built an early hypothesis. Jodie was likely abducted between 4:30 and 4:45 a.m. while approaching her car. The timeline matched with her final known phone call to the station, where she said she had overslept and would arrive soon. The scene indicated a blitz-style approach, fast, close quarters, and without a prolonged struggle. Forensic review turned next to the vehicle itself. The Mazda's interior was dry, clean, and did not appear ransacked. Her purse was not recovered inside, nor were her station documents or car keys, beyond the broken portion still lodged in the door. Nothing had been taken from the car. There was no forced entry, no sign of defensive wounds on the upholstery, and no blood traces inside. Importantly, there were no signs she ever entered the vehicle. This fact reoriented the direction of the case. Investigators determined that whatever had happened to Jodie had occurred in the narrow space between her front door and her car. That stretch, no more than 20 feet, was out of the direct line of sight from other units. It was the perfect blind zone in an otherwise open lot, quiet, shadowed, and unmonitored. One aspect that struck the investigative team was how quickly the scene had unfolded. Based on the scattered items and lack of prolonged noise reported, the event had likely lasted under a minute. The speed, the precision, and the disappearance all pointed toward premeditation. This wasn't random. This was planned. The window was narrow. Someone knew her timing. As forensic teams reviewed the evidence, analysts at the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation began cross-referencing Jodie's case with regional reports. No other abductions matching the method had occurred in recent months. No nearby sexual assaults or attacks on female news personnel. No recent parolees with known stalking behavior matching the location. They expanded the net but kept coming back to the same unknown, the vehicle. If the white van was real and not a misremembered detail, it was likely the key to solving the case. Tips began to flow in. One caller claimed to have seen a van matching the description near East Park, less than a mile from the apartment, just after dawn. Another claimed to have seen a similar van parked near a construction site the night before. Neither tip provided actionable leads. The van, if involved, was gone. In the absence of direct evidence, the physical scene remained the strongest lead. The decision was made to have the Mazda impounded and preserved for ongoing forensic review. In future years, with advancements in DNA analysis, trace evidence recovered from the door handle, and vehicle body would be resubmitted for enhanced processing. But in 1995, that capability didn't yet exist. A forensic drawing was commissioned to recreate the final known trajectory. Jodi locking her apartment door, walking toward her car, unlocking it, and encountering force before she could enter. That path and its short distance underscored a core truth. She had been taken while following the same routine she kept every weekday morning. In any missing persons case, the first 48 hours define everything that follows. In the case of Jodi Huisentruit, the morning of June 27, 1995, began not with urgency, but with assumption. That morning, when she failed to arrive at the station by 4:30 a.m., her colleagues assumed she had overslept. A producer called her apartment. Jodi answered. She said she was running late and would be in shortly. That was the last known communication from her. By the time police officially arrived at the Key Apartments shortly after 7:00 a.m., the scene outside her vehicle had already been compromised. A KIMT employee had approached her door, walked through the parking lot, and stood by the Mazda Miata, unaware that they were stepping through a crime scene. The delay in formal crime scene containment caused immediate complications for evidence integrity. In 1995, Mason City Police Department did not have a dedicated forensic unit. The initial response was handled by general patrol officers, not crime scene specialists. Per protocol, they documented the scene, but lacked the tools for precision evidence control. Only after the seriousness of the situation became clear did higher-level resources from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, and eventually the FBI begin to assemble. Coordination across agencies lacked central oversight. Local officers maintained primary control of the case for the first several days. This resulted in a lag in forensic sequencing, delayed state lab submissions, and missed opportunities for neighborhood-wide canvassing during critical early hours. In fact, by the time adjacent residents were interviewed, many had already gone to work, and weather conditions had further degraded any ground trace evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the initial response months later and noted deficiencies in the chain of custody documentation. While key items were photographed and collected, such as the broken key, hairdryer, and shoe dispersal, the absence of early containment meant potential foreign fibers, soil impressions, or secondary trace samples could no longer be accurately isolated. Compounding these issues was the lack of centralized tip line management in the first 72 hours. At least 6 calls about a white van were received by various local departments, including non-emergency lines. None were logged into a unified system until days later, resulting in duplications, incomplete notes, and delayed follow-up. One call, placed by a construction worker who claimed to see a similar van parked near East Park around 5:01 a.m., was never returned. That caller only came forward again weeks later during a media segment. In missing persons cases with suspected abduction, the ability to act swiftly on eyewitness accounts is critical. The window to locate a victim alive narrows with every hour. Jodi's case suffered from procedural inertia. Law enforcement did not declare the case an abduction until after the first full day had passed. As a result, roadblocks were not established, surveillance on major exits from Mason City was not activated, and area-wide vehicle checks were not conducted in time. The Iowa DCI entered the investigation late on day 1. Once involved, they began organizing a command post, assigned specialized interviewers, and requested lab prioritization. But their scope was limited by the absence of real-time incident management software. Coordination with the FBI came several days later, and by then the trail had cooled. Notably, the decision to delay a public alert was a calculated one. Mason City Police debated internally whether to go public with the assumption of foul play. At that time, Jodi had not been missing a full 24 hours, and no evidence of homicide or bodily harm had been recovered. They weighed the risk of panic against the chance of an overreaction. That caution would cost them. By the time a press conference was held, speculation had already taken over local radio stations. The narrative was no longer controlled by law enforcement. Media crews descended on the apartment complex. Tips flooded in, but without centralized vetting, they were disorganized and inconsistently prioritized. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence sat in backlog. The partial boot print found at the scene was cast and photographed, but not rushed to comparison. The synthetic fiber collected from the door handle was sealed but never traced to a material source. In 1995, limited lab capacity meant many non-blood DNA samples were shelved for months or years unless linked to a known suspect, and in this case, there wasn't one. The delay wasn't just in minutes, it was in mindset. This wasn't treated as an abduction from the outset, and that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Internally, the departments involved never acknowledged failure. But by 1996, when the FBI assumed a more formal role, internal memos revealed the concern. Procedural missteps in the first 24 hours may have irreparably affected the outcome. As the months passed, the investigation widened, but it never recovered the momentum of the first day. Leads went cold. The van was never located. The items collected were frozen in place by the limits of 1995 forensic science. And Jodi remained a name on posters, not on a recovered file. From a procedural standpoint, the case became a textbook example for law enforcement reform across the Midwest. Several Iowa departments introduced digital incident logging, real-time tip tracking, and cross-agency alert systems in the years following. But for Jodi, those changes came too late. The human cost of a slow response isn't just in the evidence missed. It's in the silence that follows. Families wait for answers that may never come, not because the truth is unreachable, but because its traces were walked over, under the assumption that nothing had happened yet. When an abduction leaves no witnesses and no body, the next logical step is to follow the people closest to the victim. In the days after Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, investigators did exactly that. They didn't have DNA matches. They didn't have surveillance. But they did have names, people who had access, proximity, or patterns of repeated interaction. That list began short, and it started with someone who was quick to volunteer information. John Vances was 22 years older than Jodi. He wasn't a co-worker, but he had become a recurring presence in her social circle. Friends described him as overly attentive. He owned a boat, hosted gatherings, and often photographed group outings. Days before Jodi disappeared, he'd thrown her a small birthday party at his home. The night before the abduction, he said she stopped by to watch a video from that party, just the two of them. He told police she left around 9 p.m. He was calm, cooperative, even helpful. He repeated the timeline unprompted. No visible agitation, no refusal to speak. But in certain investigations, that kind of composure isn't comforting. It's calculated. One investigator noted, the timeline fit too neatly. That was the concern. Still, they had nothing physical to tie Vances to a crime. His vehicles were searched voluntarily. His home showed no signs of forced entry or cleaning. He didn't leave town. And without a witness, without Jodi, there was no way to contradict his account. Investigators expanded the circle. They reviewed phone logs, travel history, and recent activity. Jodi's dating life was explored, not inappropriately, but methodically. She was single. She occasionally dated, but no one serious. No recent breakups. No documented threats. Her family confirmed no ongoing conflicts. Friends described no one behaving possessively. Her workplace, KMT, was also reviewed. Co-workers were cooperative. One cameraman mentioned that Jodi had seemed distracted in the week prior. Another said she had mentioned being creeped out by someone who showed up near the station parking lot twice, but she hadn't taken it further. No official complaints were made. That lead ended without a name. Then came an odd report. A woman in Mason City called the tip line anonymously, claiming she knew of someone obsessed with Jodi, someone who had written about her, taped her broadcasts, and had spoken about needing to see her alone. The tip was vague. No name was given. The woman didn't call back. The call was logged but never followed up with success. This tip might have aligned with a theory the FBI began to consider, the possibility of an unidentified parasocial fixation. The theory gained weight from Jodi's own journal, which, as noted earlier, included the line, "I think someone's watching me." Investigators couldn't determine who. There were no known stalkers. But in 1995, pre-internet, pre-social media, fixation didn't always leave a trail. Meanwhile, forensic investigators returned to Jodi's vehicle to search again with ultraviolet light and chemical tracers. Nothing new appeared. The touch DNA lifted from the doorframe was still being preserved for later analysis when technology might catch up. No prints of evidentiary value were found. The partial boot print still lacked a comparison. Each person close to Jodi was interviewed more than once. Each account was tested against available evidence. A former co-worker failed a polygraph test twice, but there was no supporting evidence to justify action, and polygraphs, even then, were inadmissible in court. Frustration began to mount. Without a body, the case had limits. There was no scene to reconstruct, no path to trace. Investigators relied entirely on inconsistencies, timing that didn't match, comments that shifted, body language that turned defensive. But no one cracked, no one confessed, no one even fled. The list of persons of interest narrowed. Von Cease remained unofficially central, not because of proof but because of absence. His proximity, his access, his rehearsed clarity. Yet every interview ended the same way, cooperative but unrevealing. It's a difficult truth in investigations like this. Sometimes the person who knows the most gives away the least. By early July 1995, less than 2 weeks after Jodi Huisentruit vanished, the case was no longer just a local mystery. It was a regional media event. News anchors across the Midwest, some of them Jodi's colleagues or former classmates, began covering her disappearance in nightly updates. What started as concern quickly turned into a media race. Every outlet wanted exclusives. Every segment needed new angles. And the pressure reached the investigation before the evidence could. Local authorities had never handled this level of visibility. National reporters began appearing outside the Mason City police station. Calls came in not only from concerned viewers, but from amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists. Rumors spread faster than official statements. With no arrest, no body, and no resolution, speculation became the loudest voice in the room. Inside the department, this created strain. Detectives working long hours were now fielding calls about dreams, psychics, and suspicious vans that might have been there, or maybe looked similar. The volume of noise made the real signals harder to hear. The department had one spokesperson. Press briefings were inconsistent. Reporters picked up details from informal hallway conversations or family interviews, not from official sources. That gap in communication allowed rumors to thrive. Some said Jodi had been secretly dating someone in law enforcement. Others claimed she had been planning to leave Mason City. None of that was verified. The FBI began advising on public messaging. They pushed for concise updates. List only confirmed facts, redirect speculation, and avoid naming persons of interest unless absolutely necessary. But the damage was already done. One major outlet published a profile on John Von Cease, using his full name, photo, and quote from his early interview. He had not been charged. He had not been arrested. But his name was now permanently connected to the case. This altered his cooperation. He limited future interviews. He stopped participating in media conversations. Investigators noted the shift, but legally it meant nothing. Without evidence, they couldn't compel anything further. The media also changed public behavior. Flyers that initially showed Jodi's face and asked for help began appearing with added reward banners and hotlines not operated by law enforcement. Independent citizens began organizing search parties, but with no training and no coordination, they disrupted potential evidence zones. One group walked the bank of Willow Creek, inadvertently trampling through ground that had not yet been forensically processed. Investigators had to pivot. They set up an internal system to log media-driven tips separately from formal leads. They stopped accepting anonymous walk-ins without time-stamped statements. And they redirected attention to what they could control, mapping known timelines, reviewing every second of the 4-5 a.m. window, and tracking who had motive, not just presence. Public sympathy remained strong, but over time, public trust eroded. Without developments, people started to question the case itself. Was it a cover-up? Was the suspect protected? Why weren't there arrests? In towns like this, silence is loud, and eventually that silence gets filled with whatever people want to believe. The team investigating Jodi's disappearance never gave up, but they had to contend with a second layer of complexity, managing public narrative while pursuing a truth they couldn't yet prove. And in a case already starved for hard evidence, misinformation became one more thing that worked against resolution. The longer the case stayed unsolved, the harder it became to separate real leads from noise. The signal was lost in the static. By 2005, 10 years had passed since Jodi vanished. The scene was no longer active. Leads had stalled. But what hadn't expired was the evidence, preserved, stored, and frozen under state protocols. And as forensic science evolved, that evidence, once inconclusive, was given a second chance. The original crime scene had produced limited physical traces, a partial boot print, a broken car key, a single strand of blonde hair, skin cell residue on the doorframe. None of these held investigative weight in 1995. But by the early 2000s, trace DNA analysis and low copy number profiling were advancing. The Mason City Police Department, working in cooperation with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, initiated a review of stored materials, including those collected from Jodi's Mazda Miata. Samples were resubmitted to the state crime lab. Unlike in the initial analysis, this time, lab techs applied mitochondrial DNA sequencing and touch DNA recovery. The material taken from the doorframe yielded enough epithelial DNA to develop a partial profile, not complete, but usable. The result didn't match anything in CODIS, the National DNA Database, but it was added to the system for future comparison. The boot print was reanalyzed using 3D scanning technology. Casts were digitally modeled and cross-referenced with updated commercial soul pattern databases. Investigators determined it resembled a common utility tread available on several brands of work boots during the 1990s. Still too broad to isolate a suspect, but useful for excluding certain profiles. One development came in the form of a new forensic tool, geoforensic soil analysis. A residue sample taken from the outer door panel of Jodi's car had gone largely unused in the original investigation. When analyzed with updated equipment, it showed a mixture of clay and trace mineral content consistent with riverside terrain, not commonly found near her apartment lot. That led investigators to revisit locations along Willow Creek, a low-traffic area east of the city previously searched in haste. This time, with LiDAR mapping and ground-penetrating radar, the Iowa DCI conducted a controlled scan of soil depth near that creek bed. Nothing of evidentiary value was recovered, but the renewed activity signaled a shift. The case was not closed and the technology was catching up. Alongside forensic reentry, digital tools were being used to re-examine behavioral data. The original interview tapes were digitized and passed through AI-assisted transcription to flag hesitations, changes in tone, and linguistic anomalies. These results didn't provide legal proof, but they supported internal pattern recognition. One early interviewee had repeatedly overspecified his timeline. The same person had previously volunteered to help in multiple search parties. He had never been named a suspect, but his file was reopened for contextual review. Meanwhile, a new tip surfaced. It came from a retired truck driver who, in 2023, submitted an anonymous note to the FindJodi.com team. He claimed to have seen a red Mazda pulled over on the side of a rural road around dawn, many years ago. He didn't remember the exact date. He didn't get close, but his description of the location and direction roughly matched the only known possible corridor out of town that lacked surveillance or traffic during the early morning hours. The tip was too vague to confirm, but it mirrored a long-standing belief among investigators. If Jodi was abducted, she wasn't held locally. She was moved, quickly and without error. The efficiency suggested preparation. Back in the lab, one more item received renewed attention: the synthetic fiber collected from Jodi's car door handle. Under new microscopic comparison, it was found to contain traces of adhesive and metallic dust, likely from manufacturing or construction material. Investigators flagged it for comparison with known vehicle interior components, particularly from vans produced in the late 1980s and early 90s. This correlated with the original witness reports of a white or light-colored van near the scene. It was circumstantial, but it pointed to industrial context, someone who worked with vehicles, machinery, or fabrication. That criteria narrowed potential profiles in the area. Cold case investigators used this to construct a new behavioral model. They focused on men aged 30, 50 at the time of the incident, employed in technical or mechanical roles, who had access to off-schedule hours and did not appear in the original investigation pool. Dozens of names were generated, backgrounds were pulled, employment records were reviewed. One name, redacted in public files, was prioritized based on overlap between job site proximity and ownership of a vehicle matching the 1995 van description. As of June 2025, no charges have been filed. The file remains active. Technology can't create evidence, but it can unearth what time and human error buried. By 2025, the file on Jodi had grown into several volumes. Thousands of pages of interviews, lab reports, aerial maps, tip-line transcripts, and handwritten notes, all organized, archived, and re-examined more than once. And still, the most critical entry remained unwritten. Confirmation of what happened to her between 4:30 and 5 a.m. on June 27, 1995. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the case had never reached the legal threshold for criminal charges. Iowa law, like most U.S. jurisdictions, allows for prosecution without a recovered body, but only when evidence is overwhelmingly persuasive. In Jodi's case, that bar was never crossed. There was no confession, no matched DNA, no forensic breakthrough definitively tying anyone to the scene. The partial genetic profile recovered from her car's door frame remained unmatched in the national database. The synthetic fiber, potentially industrial, offered a direction but no identity. And the circumstantial presence of individuals near her apartment, whether known to her or not, could not be converted into probable cause. Suspicions, patterns, and inconsistencies may raise questions, but they don't meet the burden of proof in court. Over time, the impact of that limitation extended beyond the legal system. Witnesses aged, memories faded, key individuals passed away. John Van Cise, the man widely believed to be the last person to see Jodi alive, died in December 2024. He was never charged. He was never cleared. And his death closed the door on one possible route to answers. For investigators, the loss of time was more than just procedural. It was structural. The initial crime scene had been left unsecured. Evidence was collected without the advantage of modern trace protocols. Witness reports weren't standardized. Leads weren't centralized. These lapses didn't just complicate the case, they fractured it. And no amount of scientific advancement could fully recover what was lost in those first 24 hours. In the years that followed, Jodi's case was quietly folded into training materials across Iowa. Recruits studied the investigation, not for its outcome, but for what it revealed about early response failure. It became a case not just of tragedy, but of instruction. Yet outside of law enforcement, the case never truly faded. In 2003, a group of journalists and former investigators launched finjodi.com, a dedicated platform to consolidate public information, preserve archived materials, and keep her name active. The team reviewed tip submissions, re-interviewed known associates, and conducted parallel analysis alongside the FBI and Iowa DCI. They maintained no agenda. They made no accusations. Their purpose was continuity. One of their most visible acts was a billboard placed along Highway 122 in Mason City, not far from where Jodi lived. In stark white lettering, it read, "Don't sit in silence. Someone knows something." That billboard stayed up for years, sometimes vandalized, sometimes ignored, but never taken down by the people who put it there. In her hometown of Long Prairie, Minnesota, Jodi's family continued to organize vigils each June. They didn't make public statements unless there was something new. They didn't call for revenge. They asked for closure. And even after decades, they left a light on. Her high school established a journalism scholarship in her name. Local newsrooms told her story to new interns each year, not to stir fear, but to remind young reporters that safety in small towns is never a guarantee and that presence in the public eye can carry unseen risks. In Mason City, the apartment building where Jodi lives still stands. The parking lot has been resurfaced. The tenants have changed, but there's a quiet understanding among longtime residents of what happened there, or rather, what might have happened, and what was never resolved. Law enforcement has never closed the case. Not officially. It remains active with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI. Investigators still follow up on viable tips. Technicians still retest preserved evidence with every new advance in forensic science. But there has never been an arrest. No charges, no trial. What lingers now is not just a question of who did it, but why silence has lasted longer than outrage. Jodi's disappearance continues to resonate because it wasn't high profile in the traditional sense. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She was young, ambitious, and familiar to people in a way that made her feel close, even to strangers. She was the person on your morning news, telling you about road closures and fundraisers and school events. When someone like that vanishes without explanation, the loss doesn't feel abstract. It feels personal. There's a quiet kind of justice in memory, in the refusal to forget. The people who still speak Jodie's name, whether in newsrooms, classrooms, or on message boards, aren't solving the case, but they're doing something just as important. They're resisting its erasure. Some crimes are defined by what they leave behind. This one is defined by everything it didn't. No one knows exactly what happened to Jodi Huisentruit, but what's clear, even after 30 years, is that someone does. And until they speak, the case remains open. Some stories never truly end. They remain with us, as warnings, as reminders, as quiet demands for vigilance. Jodi's disappearance taught me something I wish no one had to learn, that even in small towns, even in daylight, safety isn't guaranteed. But remembering her keeps that lesson alive. If this story moved you or made you think, let's talk about it. Do you believe this case will ever be solved? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something that felt off but said nothing? Tell me in the comments where you're from or what this story made you reflect on. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and respectfully told, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your voice helps keep these cases from being forgotten.